So, good evening from Tel Aviv, and thank you for joining us this evening for the webinar with Professor Daniel Treisman and Guy Rolnik to discuss the book Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. My name is Anat Ben David. I am Associate Professor of Communication at the Open University of Israel and one of the faculty members organizing this lecture series called Democracy on the Bar. Thank you to my Open University colleagues who helped organize this event. The next event in our series will take place next Wednesday, in which historian Professor Alexander Jacobson from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem will talk about the political history of constitutional struggles. And now to the topic of this evening's seminar. A few months ago, I read a fascinating book written by Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman titled Dictators, The Changing Face of Tyranny in the 21st Century. The book provides a deeply researched comparative analysis of authoritarian politics in countries such as Russia, Hungary, Singapore, Turkey, and Venezuela. Israel is not mentioned in the book, but as I read it, I couldn't help thinking whether some of the principles outlined in the book do not already apply here where we live. Regardless of the Israeli context, there is so much to learn from this book on how dictatorships thrive in the 21st century. It is therefore my utmost pleasure to introduce Professor Daniel Treisman as our special guest this evening. He is Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. A graduate of Oxford University and Harvard University, he has published 5 books and numerous articles in leading political science and economics journals, including the American Political Science Review and the American Economic Review, as well as in public affairs journals such as Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. His research focuses on Russian politics and economics, as well as comparative political economy, including in particular the analysis of democratization, the politics of the authoritarian states, political decentralization, and corruption. It is also my pleasure to introduce Guy Rolnik as the moderator of the webinar. I assume most Israeli participants recognize Rolnik as the most influential business and economics journalist in Israel, promoting open, competitive markets with strong social safety net and considered a leader in the fight against corruption. Guy founded Israeli media organization TheMarker and is a deputy publisher of Haaretz daily newspaper. In 2013, Rolnik was awarded the Sokolov Lifetime Achievement Award for founding TheMarker, changing public discourse and influencing the government and legislators to undertake significant changes in the structure of the Israeli economy. Guy is also clinical professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He teaches courses on economic policy, media and regulation in Chicago, Tel Aviv University, and Reichman University. We will begin with the talk by Professor Treisman, followed by a Q&A with Guy Rolnik. Should the time allow, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. You're invited to type your questions in the chat box. Professor Treisman, thank you so much for being with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anat. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me just rearrange my screen for 1 second. Right. So I'm very happy to be here to talk about a book which came out last year, and the paperback edition is just out. This is a book that I co-authored with my friend Sergei Guriev. And it really began from the observation that the style and modus operandi of dictators around the world was changing. So if we think about the classic 20th century dictatorships, they were characterized by very violent repression, often combined with ideology. So Hitler, Stalin, Mao imprisoned millions of political prisoners, killed millions of their citizens. But even in the regimes which were not totalitarian, in the 20th century, many of the authoritarian regimes were also very bloody, large numbers of deaths and imprisonment of dissidents in those countries. But if we look at some of the leading heads of authoritarian regimes around the world in recent decades, many of them look a bit different. So besides the change from military fatigues to business suits, we think underneath that they are actually achieving many of the same things that the old style dictators in the 20th century did. They create a concentration of power. They centralize power, eliminate checks and balances, but they manage to do so with much less violence or even fear. They tend to have no official ideology. Most often there's a kind of anti-Western resentment rather than any kind of formal doctrine. And they imitate democracy. They pretend to be effective, competent leaders who are winning elections based on merit. And as best we can tell, of course, there are difficulties with polling in authoritarian regimes, but as best we can tell, these examples had genuine popular support, at least at some points. So, of course, we're not saying that there are no old-style, very violent dictators left. Here are a couple. And we're also not saying that there were no, that all the dictators of the 20th century were equally violent. There were some who were a bit more restrained. We do want to argue, and we make this case in the book, that there has been a shift in the balance of types of dictatorships from what we call fear dictators, that's the old 20th century overtly repressive type, to what we call spin dictators. And the central idea of spin dictatorship is that you don't necessarily need to scare people into submission in order to concentrate power and dominate society, control the whole political sphere. If you can manipulate information so that people wrongly believe that you are a democratic, competent, benevolent leader, and they actually support you quite sincerely, if nevertheless based on misperceptions. So in the book, we describe various data, and we also have explored this data, these data sets in academic articles, and we came up with a basic measure of the type of dictatorships, the type of authoritarian regimes. This is based on the levels of political killings by the state, political imprisonment, political prisoners, use of torture, the presence or absence of some opposition media, the type of elections, whether some opposition is allowed to run. And based on these measures that we put together, we get the following picture, which suggests that really in the last 50 years, especially since the 1970s and 1980s, there's been a decrease in the frequency of the old fear dictators and an increase in this type that we're calling spin dictatorship. Okay, let me illustrate with some examples and cases. So one of perhaps the key thing that distinguishes fear dictatorships from spin dictatorships, obviously, is that fear dictators rule through fear, while spin dictators rule through deception. So show evidence that since the 1970s and 1980s, fewer leaders in dictatorships have overseen very large numbers of political killings, have held large numbers of political prisoners, and have been accused of torturing political prisoners. Now, sadly, the proportion of authoritarian governments where there are credible allegations of torture of political prisoners is still very high, about 75% among the cohort of authoritarian leaders that came to power in the 2000s. But that's down from the 1980s, when it was around 95%. Now, it's not just that spin dictators use less violence than fear dictators. there's a difference in how they present or conceal their repression. So fear dictators very consciously publicize their violence. It's part of their strategy to spread fear, to intimidate the population. They want people to know about just how brutal the regime is. By contrast, spin dictators, when they do use violence, try to conceal it, to camouflage it, to present it as, rather than being political victimization of their rivals, efforts to protect the population from terrorism or from other threats. Okay, so just one example, perhaps the quintessential fear dictator was Muammar Gaddafi. And Gaddafi, in public statements, made fun of leaders who had their political enemies run over by cars or poisoned so as to conceal the fact that they were being assassinated by the regime. He said in one very interesting quote, he said, "We don't do that. He whom we have executed on television." And it was really the sort of the idea behind this 20th century model in its extreme form. You don't just intimidate the population through violence, you do it on TV. You use the media to spread fear. Let's contrast that with a more recent non-democratic leader. And I should say that Vladimir Putin, in his early years, was one of the pioneers, one of the developers of the spin dictatorship model. Since then, especially in the last 5 years, starting perhaps 10 years ago, he's become what we now consider to be a fear dictator with very high, very overt attempts to intimidate the population. But in his early years, less so. So when he was asked about the murder of a political opponent, Boris Nemtsov, outside the Kremlin, could it be that the Kremlin had anything to do with this? Well, of course not, is his reply. We need to finally rid Russia of disgraces and tragedies like the provocative murder of Boris Nemtsov right in the center of the capital. So it's a very different approach. So how do spin dictators manage with less overt repression? A number of tricks. For instance, the old fear dictators often put their enemies in jail for 10, 20 years at a time. Spin dictators prefer to repeatedly arrest opposition activists for short spells. So rather than lock them up for 10 years, you arrest them for a few weeks. Ideally, right before they plan to organize protests against the government. And then you continually do this, a sort of rolling, revolving door incarceration system. And this attracts a bit less attention from Amnesty International and other human rights groups. So this guy, Ilya Yashin, a leading pro-democracy activist in Russia, was arrested 5 times in a row for short spells when he was trying to run for Moscow City Council. Another trick is, rather than going after your rivals, your opponents, on overtly political grounds, you prosecute them for ostensibly non-political crimes, and ideally crimes that will tarnish the reputation of your opponent, that will make them seem unattractive in some ways. So for instance, in Turkey under Erdogan, this Kurdish politician, Nurettin Demirtas, was arrested for allegedly using a fake health certificate to avoid military service. Okay, so this sends the message that he's a coward. Now, fear dictators don't just conceal their violence, they also conceal, fear dictators don't just publicize their violence, they also publicize the fact when they censor the media. And by contrast, spin dictators, when they censor the media, try to do so in a way that's not so noticeable, because if people see them censoring, then they obviously realize that they have something to conceal, that they're not the open, transparent benevolent democrats that they pretend to be. So obvious examples, the Nazis were very public about censorship, and many other authoritarian regimes in the 20th century, we give examples in the book, were very public about censoring literature, newspapers that they didn't approve of. Spin dictators tend to do what Alberto Fujimori did in Peru in the 1990s. Here we see a video still of his security chief, Vladimir Montesinos, bribing a media executive to provide positive coverage on TV. Now, of course, part of spin dictatorship is pretending to be democratic. So, of course, they hold elections, and they also try to make these elections look a little bit more credible than the, say, Soviet elections of the 20th century, in which the Communist Party candidates won with 99.99% of the vote. So how do they do this? Well, first of all, we see since the 90s, the era of rising spin dictatorship, they less often ban candidates from elections outright. More often, they harass the candidates, and they use media bias. They impose media bias to make sure that they win these supposedly free and fair elections. Other differences, well, as I said, unlike fear dictators, spin dictators tend not to have any official ideology. Instead, they cultivate a rhetoric of competence and public service. So again, pretending to be good democratic leaders rather than a rhetoric of fear. And to explore this, what Sergei and I did was we selected speeches by about 15 leaders of different types, both from recent decades and from a little bit further back. We looked at the speeches of democratic leaders, fear dictators, and spin dictators. And we wanted to see whether we would detect this difference in the rhetorical style. And specifically what we did is we looked for how frequently these speeches included words associated with violence, and how frequently they included words associated with economic performance and provision of public services. So we plot this on the graph. And here, first of all, selected fear dictators. We see that, as expected, they're quite high in vocabulary of violence and not that high in vocabulary of economic performance and public service. Now, if we put on selected democratic leaders, we see that in general, as we expected, they came higher on economic performance and public services, lower on violence. There's one interesting kind of exception here, which is Eisenhower. And if you think about it, it's not so surprising because Eisenhower was president at the height of the Cold War. And so a lot of what he was talking about in his speeches was missiles and threats. So that's why he overlaps, as we see, with the fear dictators. But the real question for us was, where would the spin dictators fall on this graph? Would they blend in with the spin dictators with the fear dictators, or would the spin dictators blend in with the Democrats, as we expected? And we found that these spin dictators, at least, even outdid the Democrats in some cases on vocabulary of economic performance and public services. So Lee Kuan Yew, Nazarbayev, very high on those. All of them relatively low in rhetoric of violence. So they blend in with the Democrats and adopt this rhetoric of competence and professionalism rather than trying to scare, to spread anxiety in the population. Okay, that's a nutshell characterization of the different styles of dictator and some evidence that there has been this trend towards spin dictatorship. Why do we see this change? Well, we think that it comes down to a combination of modernization and globalization. The world has changed, and this is a reaction to that. Now, of course, political scientists or economists will recognize that there's a famous theory out there, modernization theory, that says that economic development should eventually lead to democracy. And we agree with that in part, but we add that what matters is not just modernization within a given country, but modernization worldwide. So as many countries around the world develop economically and socially, that leads to the emergence of global movements like human rights movements and global media, which create pressures even on countries which are not so economically developed to at least pretend to be more democratic. And the second point we'd make is that this process of economic development associated with globalization doesn't always produce democracy immediately, because dictators, if they're smart, can delay by adopting the strategies of spin dictatorship. Now, modern societies with knowledge economies are harder to control through terror, but they can be manipulated, at least for a while. So we see spin dictatorship as a reaction to this modernization and globalization, which doesn't work indefinitely and has obvious costs, but can help an authoritarian leader sustain his regime in a more modern world, at least for a while. So if we're right about this, what does this imply about the future of authoritarianism around the world? Well, if modernization and globalization continue, then we would expect the pressure on fear dictators to turn to spin to increase, and that there would be increasing pressure also on spin dictators to democratize. However, if modernization stalls and globalization reverses, some people already think that there's been a move towards deglobalization rather than globalization. We don't really see strong evidence of that yet, but it's obviously possible. Well, if this process stalls or reverses, well, then probably the pressures on dictators to move in this direction will be much weaker. Now, in individual cases, I should point out that when spin fails, when the model stops working, perhaps because the society has continued to modernize and become, in a sense, too modern, or because of economic crisis increasing the pressure, at this point, spin dictators sometimes revert to fear dictatorship. And we saw this in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, followed by Maduro, who adopted a much more overtly repressive style of rule. We saw that in Turkey with the early Erdogan, who was much more pro-Western, much more democratic, open, transitioning to the late Erdogan, especially after the 2016 failed coup attempt, who is using a more violent rhetoric, who is much more open about imprisoning and pursuing political opponents. And of course, we see this with Putin, who has progressed in the last 10 years from spin to clearly a version of fear dictatorship. But I should also say that in modern globalized societies, it's difficult to make fear dictatorship work. I mean, spin dictatorship can be hard, but fear dictatorship, violent repression in a modern globalized society tends to undermine the economy. So we see poor economic performance in all these three cases. So going back to fear, I think, is a temporary fix. It's a last resort rather than a strategy that is likely to work over the medium run. If you buy what I've said so far, how should Western democracies respond? In the book, we argue for something we call adversarial engagement. So there are some people who think that the West should simply decouple from the authoritarian world, from China, from other authoritarian states. We don't think that's possible. Whether or not it's desirable, we don't think that's possible. Pathogens, technological advances, ideas, they're going to continue to cross borders. And there isn't really a way to isolate a country, and attempts to do that usually end badly. They don't work, and they hamper the country rather than protecting it. So we think the Western democracies have to remain engaged, but we think how they do that could change. In part, we think Western democracies need to be just much more conscious about the nature of their relations with the authoritarian world. They need to monitor better with better counterintelligence, cybersecurity, financial monitoring, because a lot of these authoritarian regimes, especially the spin dictatorships, but also other ones, are exploiting their ties with Western democracies in various ways, spreading corruption in various ways. I think it's the next step is very important. The democracies need to reform at home for various reasons and in various ways. So we need to think about supply chain resilience. We need to ensure that trade relationships don't create vulnerabilities that authoritarian regimes can exploit. We also need to stop enabling dictators. So there's this really pretty developed industry in the US, in Europe, in many parts of the world, in the democratic world, this industry of lobbyists, lawyers, bankers, even tech companies that are providing the shell companies, influencing governments in favor of these authoritarian governments, helping to circumvent laws, hiding money, and providing surveillance tools to authoritarian governments, making their lives much easier. We need to stop that. We need to find ways consistent with democracy and liberal rights to regulate and discourage this whole authoritarian supporting set of industry of activities. And we need to repair our democracy. Ultimately, there's competition for ideas, and democracy needs to be the inspiring model for the world that it actually is. It needs to seem that more transparently, and that has various aspects to it, from greater transparency to improving some aspects of democracies around the world. We need also to defend and reform international institutions, which are exploited by spin dictators and other types of dictators too at times. So Viktor Orban in Hungary becomes a member of the EU and then manages to extract large subsidies while blackmailing the EU to obtain greater benefits and to prevent decisions he doesn't like. Interpol has been used by authoritarians, in particular Putin in Russia, to harass and intimidate dissidents, political opponents, when they travel abroad. And we need to support democracy democratically. That means the democracies need to join forces to support democracy, not with military force. That doesn't seem to be very effective. If you look at the attempts, it can be effective in very rare cases when a country is completely occupied, as after World War II in Japan, in Italy, and Germany. But generally, it's a big mistake, in my opinion. We need to support democracy democratically, appeal to global public opinion, forge coalitions, and so on. Now, I understand that I'm talking to people in a democracy, which, like my own, is undergoing certain strains at the moment. So are democracies vulnerable in this new world? Some spin dictators that I've talked about have emerged from backsliding within weak democracies. So if we look around, Viktor Orban in Hungary, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Alberto Fujimori in Peru, these are people who adopted a style of spin dictatorship, but they started in democracies. So this does seem to be a danger. And we see some leaders in democracies who seem to be trying for something like this. So Silvio Berlusconi, during his years in power in Italy, he controlled the vast majority of TV in Italy, and he put pressure on the media to support his regime in various ways. Donald Trump, we've all heard way too much about him. He's a perfect example of somebody who uses some of these techniques in an attempt to increase his own power and weaken rivals. And then there are other possible cases we could think about. So just a few words about Israel. I should say, by no means expert at all on Israel. So this may be superficial. You may want to reject what I have to say. But I've read a little bit about the current debates. And a first point that we need to recognize is that not all reforms that strengthen the executive are undemocratic. There are a range of different relationships between executive, legislature, and judiciary in different democracies. But some attempts to strengthen the executive are undemocratic. It's clearly a pattern among spin dictators to try to mess around with the judiciary. So we see Chavez expanded Venezuela's Supreme Court and then packed it with supporters. Orban restructured the constitutional court in a way that favored his interests. We know that there's a close relationship between Netanyahu and certain well-known spin dictators. So in particular, Viktor Orban, the two seem to get along very well. They both used the same political consultant, Arthur Finkelstein, an American Republican Party, so-called master of the dark arts of political campaigning. Finkelstein was the person who reportedly devised the campaign that Orban mounted against George Soros, a campaign that many found troubling in the images and the associations that it evoked. In the case of Israel, I think Netanyahu isn't the whole of it. There are other things that I think Israelis need to think about. Everybody should be extremely proud of the success of the tech industry in Israel. It's really amazing. But in recent years, a lot of the stories about the tech industry in Israel have focused on companies that seem to have been, or at least are accused of, having enabled dictators in various ways. So why is this happening? And is this something that should be regulated in a different way? And then we see some cases of Israel under Netanyahu, but perhaps even before, forging relationships with authoritarian leaders who are accused of serious human rights abuses. Of course, no country can refuse to deal with the leaders of important countries around the world. Diplomacy isn't a matter of negotiating only with the people we like, but there are some choices about how strong and how warm certain relationships will be, especially with relatively minor powers. And I have to say, I was very surprised. And obviously, I'm not talking just about Israel, I'm talking about the US as well. But I was quite surprised to see Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, invited to address AIPAC. So there are issues that you know much more than I do about, but which seem to me worth thinking about. So what prevents, in democracies, what prevents the slide into spin dictatorship? I said that there are individual politicians who seem to be trying to push things in that direction. Well, I think what holds that back, what explains why that fails in some cases, is active resistance by what in the book we call the informed. It's a shorthand for people with human capital, not necessarily the rich, but people with human capital, high education, international connections, and organizational and communication skills. all of these are necessary in order to fight back effectively against would-be spin dictators. That means lawyers, judges, civil servants, journalists, NGO activists, academics, and many others. And that part of society is one of the things which grows as economic and social modernization takes place, which is why we think we see this relationship between economic and social modernization and more stable democracy, more consolidated democracy. It's not because of some underlying structural factor. I think it's because of the activity of a part of the population which is strengthened by modernization. And so we see in a number of cases would-be spin dictators, or at least leaders who seem to be trying to adopt something like spin dictatorship, failing. There's no guarantee that this will continue to be the case in all countries, but we have seen some reassuring failures of attempts to impose a kind of manipulative regime with highly centralized power within democracies. Okay, just to wrap up very, very quickly. So what am I saying? Well, spin dictatorship seems to be gradually overtaking the model based on fear, although not in all countries at all times. And the essence of this model is to use information manipulation to boost the popularity of the dictator in the place of mass terror and ideological brainwashing. Spin dictators fake democracy, but somehow they always, or until the end, they always seem to win the elections that they hold. They cultivate a rhetoric of competence and effectiveness. We see this model as better adapted to life in a world with open borders, economic interdependence, global media, and highly educated populations. But eventually, those same trends make spin unsustainable. And then democracy is the only stable option. But that, of course, doesn't mean that spin dictators recognize that and opt for democracy. They may try to hang on by reverting to old-style repression, as we've seen. Thanks very much. I look forward to questions and comments.
Professor Treisman, thank you very much for this amazing, insightful talk, and thank you for taking the time to join us. So we have a lot of questions about your book and research, and I was planning to be very disciplined about when do I get to the Israeli questions. But since last night, the Israeli parliament, as you may have known, started the approval process of the political takeover of the courts. So some people argue that actually we are now on the road to some kind of authoritarian / dictatorship. So we do need some urgent advice here. Many of the Israelis still are refusing to accept the possibility that Israel will take the path to some kind of authoritarian government. And here I have two questions to you, building up on your comments in Israel. The first one is that the Israeli economy is thriving in the last couple of years, has to do a lot with technology, real estate, and the growth in population in many ways. They all contribute to a strong economy and low unemployment. And the question is, do you see in your research, do we see in recent decades in the history situations where actually you have an economy that is doing fine and yet is backsliding from a democracy to spin dictatorship? And an adjacent question to that is the path. Is the prevailing path is from aggressive, oppressive dictatorship to spin dictatorship, or actually there are now more and more examples for moving from some kind of democracy, it may be a thin democracy or a weak democracy, straight to spin dictatorship.
Mm-hmm. Right. So first of all, yes, it's not uncommon to have degeneration of the regime towards spin dictatorship at times of economic success. So great example is Russia in the first 8 years of the century, right? So 2000 up until the financial crisis, Russia was doing better and better economically. Economic development has two consequences. On the one hand, it creates these pressures on an incumbent government to become more democratic. So we saw that in Russia. By 2008, you get waves of volunteering. You get the young generation increasingly connected by internet and so on. And then, so when Putin tried to come back, well, he did come back, but in 2011 to 2012, society was kind of primed to resist, and we saw mass demonstrations. So economic development creates pressure on incumbents that may lead them to cut corners and try to use tools to consolidate their power, which are not democratic. At the same time, it increases the resources of the incumbent. So we see that in Russia during these boom years in the early 2000s. The state becomes much stronger, the revenues are greater, and Putin has a lot of resources with which to buy off parts of the population, to buy off the media, and to really set up this structure without people complaining too much, because they're more preoccupied at that point with economic affairs, with improving living standards and so on. Yeah, there's no simple relationship in which you always get spin dictatorship in times of declining economy and not in times of economic boom. Economic boom can be quite a challenge for weak democracies. And I'm not saying Israel was such a weak democracy. The second point, and it's really related to that, I have quite a lot of confidence in Israel not to become a spin dictatorship. And I have a bit of skepticism about some of this recent discourse on democratic backsliding. I think there are some things which do tend to render countries quite resistant to attempts at spin dictatorship or at backsliding of different kinds. That doesn't mean that they face no danger at all. Of course, they sometimes face danger. They sometimes face these challenges, but they have more resources to resist. And I think Israel has a lot of resources, has a long democratic tradition, has a high level of education, of economic development, of civil society, I think, which are the ingredients that go into resistance to attempts to change the political system in an authoritarian direction. Of course, just that you have those resources doesn't mean that they'll be activated. The key part is activating them, organizing, mobilizing, and so on. Still, I have some confidence. And I would say that if we look at the big picture in terms of democratic backsliding, yes, there are reasons to be concerned. Yes, there are some key cases, but if you look at almost any measure of the extent of democracy around the world, we see that, for instance, some people may know the VDEM democracy measures. Well, according to VDEM, there were, in 1974, 23% of countries around the world were democracies. In 2016, we hit a peak of 54%, so up from 23% to 54%. According to VDEM, we're now down to 50%. So according to them, there has been some regression, but it's still relatively small compared to the massive spread of democracy during the so-called third wave of democracy since the early 70s. And in part, I think some of the backsliding, a lot of the backsliding, is because there were countries that were caught up in the wave of democratization that in some ways lacked the preconditions at that point. They had very little democratic experience. They were economically less developed. They had less civil society. They had lower levels of education. And as a result, they were more vulnerable to challenges to democracy. That doesn't apply to every case, but it applies to quite a few.
Propaganda and manipulating public perception plays a big role in your model of spin dictators. Can you explain what specifically is the role of media and the news media in your model in countries that you studied? And perhaps how exactly does it work, the mechanics of using media to manipulate public perception?
Well, obviously there are differences across countries, but very often a spin dictator will covertly co-opt big parts of the media. Sometimes a leader will take over in a situation where much of the media is state-owned and there are weak barriers to politicization. And so in that case, they can use the state media basically for propagandistic purposes. But even when that's not the case, leaders can come into power and covertly pay off big media companies. There are different ways that this can be done. Some of them are with direct bribes, as we saw in that picture of Vladimir Montesinos in Peru, but they can also do it through regulatory exemptions, through allowing mergers, through basically having friendly businesses take over private media companies, creating the environment for that. They can do it through taxes, differential taxes on advertising and so on. In some cases, where there's a scarcity of newsprint, or I'm thinking of Venezuela in the crisis years, they can make it difficult for opposition newspapers to get the paper, to print their papers, to the extent that it's not all on the internet anyway. They can encourage private advertisers to only advertise in the loyal media and so on. So there's a whole range of different things which we see actually cropping up in multiple cases across countries. And there does seem to be some process of learning by which the political teams under different authoritarian leaders look around the world and apply tricks that they see being used elsewhere.
So I believe it was sometimes after World War II that the media scholars developed the what they call the hypodermic needle theory, that media just can brainwash people and voters. But as we know, this line of research didn't survive a lot of empirical research. And we do know that media does influence us, but the ability to really shift and influencing voting patterns is limited. But your research shows that there is, correct me if I'm wrong, some point when perhaps you control directly or indirectly an important part of the news media, you can cement the control of it in the country and shift voting patterns.
I think it's really complicated, and it's fascinating, but I think there's a lot of interesting research in political science and media studies these days, and it paints a complicated picture. So you're absolutely right. A lot of the political science research suggests that, especially in democracies, at the margin, it's pretty hard to change people's political beliefs or political preferences in terms of voting. Political advertising doesn't have much effect, although that may be in part just because it tends to be balanced. There's kind of an equilibrium in which the different parties both invest heavily in certain races. But it's hard to change people's opinions. And I think what we're learning about the type of manipulation in these milder authoritarian regimes is several things. First of all, you don't need to have comprehensive censorship. You don't need to block out all the discordant voices. It's enough to discredit the liberal media, to marginalize them, to keep them small. And then they simply won't influence the mass base of the regime in power. The second thing is you can do an enormous amount through agenda setting. Rather than trying to persuade people of one particular position, you can focus their minds on an issue which serves you and doesn't help the liberal media. Often that involves creating the perception of some external threat. And I said the fear dictators focus on threat. Still, spin dictators in a milder way do like to present themselves and their country as being somehow victimized by the rest of the world or not sufficiently respected. And that's these nationalist appeals can be quite effective at least diverting attention to something which helps the incumbent. And the third point is it's not so much about facts, it's about emotions. So, and also repetition. So with emotions, a lot of it is, it's not Pavlovian conditioning, but when you're given a lot of news stories which make you feel good about your country. So on the one hand, it's allowing you to feel something positive, and this transfers over obviously to the person at the top. And then if you repeatedly give this reinforcement, people really become accustomed to the kind of media of positive feelings. I have a student who did research on Russian media watchers, and she gave something like a blind taste test to respondents. What she did was she presented news stories without telling from where they came. News stories from the pro-Putin state media and news stories from the opposition liberal media. And what she found was that the state media evokes very positive emotions, almost irrespective of what the focus of the story is. A lot of pride, positive emotions, and the opposition media evokes negative emotions, even among the regular viewers, the people who choose to view the opposition media. And if you think about that, that's not so surprising, because it's really kind of painful to be told that you're being led by a sociopath who has started an unnecessary war, which is killing thousands, tens of thousands of people. The message that the opposition has is a hard one for people to absorb. It's an unpleasant truth. So truth hurts, and spin dictators exploit that. They tell people something which will be comfortable for them, and of course, which serves their own interest. And the people then themselves do a lot of the self-censoring or the exclusion or disregarding of unpleasant messages.
Do you see any special role, especially in the last, 5 to 10 years, to social networks in the toolbox of the spin dictator?
Yeah, well, some of them have clearly used this very intensively. And again, this is a subject where there's a lot of research. The research on the prevalence of these things is much more advanced than the research on the effectiveness of these things. We don't know as much about whether all this bombarding people with Facebook messages works, but we do know that a number of these spin dictators have been using bots, trolls, what have you, to try and influence public opinion, both in their own country and abroad. We course, we all read about the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg and the 2016 US presidential election and the US election since then. So clearly they're trying. China has a slightly different model. China we consider to be a very high-tech fear dictatorship. Xi Jinping uses quite violent rhetoric when he talks about Hong Kong and Tibet, and dissidents are forced to make confessions on national TV. So there's a lot of the old model of fear dictatorship, of spreading anxiety in the strategy of Xi Jinping now. It may have changed since before about 2012, but at the same time, it's very high tech. And they've developed various tools of internet manipulation, which involve a lot of covert censorship, despite it being a fear dictatorship. So in that sense, it's kind of hybrid. But those same techniques, I think, are being used in places like Russia, in the Gulf, I think, in various other authoritarian states. So to try and make certain things harder to access. Of course, some websites are just overtly blocked, but others are just made harder to access. And it turns out, research suggests, that just putting relatively mild barriers, just creating inconvenience, is often enough to get people not to seek out information that goes against the regime.
So moving back from, and perhaps this is going to be the last question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience, back from social networks to the mainstream media, television. So in Israel, we have two very powerful news channels. Of course, Netanyahu complains nonstop, like all other would-be autocrats, that they are biased against him. While many people actually think it's the opposite, and actually they are more and more playing in his favors. Now, as researchers, how can we assert at a particular moment what is the role of the media, the news media in manufacturing the consent or the conditions needed for a takeover of democracy, or in the case of Israel, pushing forward, shepherding the judicial reform. When we look at them, what are the red flags? What are the parameters? How can we say this is a media landscape that is perhaps starting to manufacture the consent to push us in that direction of spin dictators, or some kind of we have a more color of dictatorship?
Right. Well, I would look at various things. Of course, I mean, obviously, look for, through investigative journalism, evidence of actual co-optation of these media companies. But then looking at the content of media companies in the social environment, is there polarization such that certain groups are using their own favored network or channel and others are using different? And in that case, how are those relationships between audiences and the network consolidated? What is the nature of those, and how does the news coverage differ across the different networks, and perhaps from foreign coverage of the same events, so on. So all of those things can be studied. I'm shamefully ignorant about the media environment in Israel, so I don't know if there's something like Fox News, which basically in the Israeli context would be the go-to network for Netanyahu supporters and supporters of groups further to the right. If there's something like that, then you also want to be doing the kind of research that people have done in the US to try and estimate how much watching Fox News or its equivalents affects voting behavior in elections. There have been some studies that did that in inventive ways in the US.
Yeah. So had you asked us this question about do we have Fox News in Israel a year ago, we would say that first Netanyahu was trying to get his friend Rupert Murdoch to come to Israel, and that didn't work out. Murdoch didn't want to open a Fox News like in Israel, but he was able to get an Ukrainian, I believe, oligarch to do to mimic some kind of Fox, and that didn't. Up until recently, that didn't work out well, and the ratings were low. But interestingly enough, in the last 2 months, since Netanyahu and his partners announced the judicial reform, we see the ratings in this channel, it's called Channel 14, actually, we see a significant uptick in this channel. And actually, I believe it was today, for the first time, where they started to report meaningful rating numbers. And they are that you don't need to be a media scholar or researcher or to do a lot of content analysis in order to, I believe, to categorize Channel 14 as overt propaganda machine. So let's now take a few very quick questions because we're running out of time from the audience. So Sayar asks, young people get more news from the internet apps and less from newspaper media. How does that influence the success of spin dictators? Basically, that young people really don't follow the news anymore, or watch, or get only very short snippets from Twitter or from TikTok.
Right. Well, okay, so there's different aspects of that. On the one hand, it creates an incentive for these regimes to try and be sophisticated in reaching young people through the internet, through kind of covert propaganda, through bots pretending to be young people and so on. That's one aspect. The other aspect is if this is resulting in young people just being much more superficial about the news, it may be that this is actually making young people harder for these authoritarian regimes to reach. So I think there's going to be different effects, perhaps working against each other. We do know that well, I keep coming back to Russia. Maybe I shouldn't emphasize it so much. I just know more about it. But in Russia, there's this really striking age gradient in support for Putin, in support for the war. It's natural, I suppose. People in military conscription age are more worried about conscription than older people. But that, I think, is partly due to the internet and the fact that the older generation, although it's increasingly using the internet in Russia, is still using it far less than the young generation and the young generations, I should say.
Yeah. So Guy Chetzoroni has a question. He talks about the populist rhetoric of the people versus the elite, asks whether it's universal to all 21st century spin dictators, and what do you think is the most efficient strategy against to combat this kind of rhetoric?
Yeah, it's not universal, but it's quite common. So if we look at spin dictators, they come from different parts of the political spectrum. So we have some who are on the left, like Hugo Chavez, others who are more, you would say, on the conservative side, like, well, Lee Kuan Yew, who we see as the great pioneer of spin dictatorship. We also, if we think about the anti-elitist rhetoric, well, Putin didn't really have that until about 2012 or so. He was much more a sort of universalist, trying to bring everybody into the coalition with some kind of patriotic rhetoric, but more the kind of patriotic rhetoric that united. For instance, he was not about dividing on ethnic lines. He was early on, very inclusive in his ethnic language, while, of course, demonizing Chechens because of the war and so on. But that changed, and he became, from about 2011, 2012, much more, and 2013 especially, much more about a big division between the disloyal, liberal, pro-European, decadent elites and the true Russians, the masses, the people in the factory towns and so on. And so he's really emphasized that division from then on, and he became very much like many populists who attack the elite. But that's just to say that there was a period when he wasn't doing that. Lee Kuan Yew was never a populist in that sense. He was always much more kind of expecting deference and supporting a kind of a deferential, meritocratic image of society in which the elite was respected. But we see more and more of this kind of populist language in other cases. Of course, Hugo Chavez was very populist as well. Fujimori, I don't think so. Well, yes, there was an element of that. And there's often this kind of outsider, even if it's not explicitly anti-elite, there'll often be this kind of outsider against the past, essentially. I'm somebody new, I have new ideas, and give me a chance.
Okay, so we already ran out of time, so one last question that just popped up in the chat, and I think might be useful for everyone. The question is, how do spin dictators respond to experts, academics, and their opinions? The reason Shirley is asking that question is because when we look at at Netanyahu, we see that up until recently, Netanyahu actually respected most of the time the experts, unlike for perhaps his friend Donald Trump. Yet recently, especially in the last few weeks, when there is so much criticism from economists in Israel and abroad on his judicial reform, he has, of course, grown more critical of them, and actually is now ignoring them or saying they don't get what we're doing here.
Right. Well, I think all spin dictators want to cultivate their own experts, right? Whether they're real experts or not. On the other hand, this stratum of society that I call the informed tends to include all legitimate experts, and they tend to be, over time at least, in opposition, or even from early on, in opposition to a leader who is actually a spin dictator. They see this much faster than the rest of the population. So often you get this clash between a spin dictator and the independent experts. So yeah, to the extent that they can fool even the experts, then they're very happy. But once the real experts realize what they're doing, there's this tension, and then perhaps they try to cultivate, their own pseudo experts, so that they can continue to maintain this image of being, democratic politicians, sophisticated, modern, like in other countries, even though they're not.
So, Professor Treisman, before we bid you farewell, we want to thank you for this amazing talk, and particularly for your opening statement about Israel, that actually you are optimistic about Israel. And at this point in time, after what happened yesterday in the parliament, I think that we admire the courage on your behalf to make such a prediction. And
I'm relying on you to prove me right. It's not something that will be proven right all by itself.
Okay, definitely. Professor Treisman, thank you very much for taking the time and joining us today.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Professor Anat Ben-David for putting together this amazing event. Thank you very much, Anat.
Thank you very much to both of you and to all of the participants who spent this very late time in the evening to listen to very interesting and relevant ideas, which we can all contemplate in the coming days. Thank you so much, Professor Treisman and Guy Rolnik. Have a good evening.
Thank you.